Okay, so this is the second last lecture of Biology 3804. And before I get started, I just wanted to advertise that there's a new fourth year course that's going to be offered this fall that you may be interested in. It's all about the origins of life. So it's ideas about how life came to be several billion years ago on Earth. Okay, so what are we going to cover today in this lecture? Well, I want to start off by talking a little bit about public goods games and look at the results from our public goods bonus game that you were able to play. And then I'm going to get into a topic that I find really fascinating, social learning, social cognition, and the wisdom of crowds. And I just want to add that I'm going to post one more pre-recorded lecture video after this one. I'll try to post it this week if I can, and the final lecture will be all about culture in animals. As a couple of reminders, on Friday, March 25, we have another paper discussion and group assignment. The paper for this week is by Sasaki and Biro, and it's all about collective navigation by homing pigeons. And as usual, you can either join on campus or you can meet on Zoom. And next Wednesday, March 30, during our scheduled class time at 8:35 a.m. on Zoom, we're going to have a small number of short guest talks by people doing research in social evolution. We'll have some work on insects. I'm hoping somebody will come to speak about some spider work as well. And we'll have one of my students who's going to speak about some of our work on birds. And so if you attend on March 30, and if you attend both the student presentation sessions in this class the following week on April 6 and 8, and you fill out the attendance forms during those three synchronous sessions, there's an opportunity to earn a 1% bonus on your overall course grade. I'll also mention that our guest speakers who will be on Zoom on next Wednesday, the material from their talks might be covered on the final exam. And I will record the Wednesday, March 30 presentation so that students who can't make it can watch the recording. Okay, excuse me. Before I get into public goods, there's something I wanted to touch on that kind of followed on our paper discussion from last week. So last week we read the paper about the wallet experiment, and there was that really interesting big differences between the different countries, the different cultures where they did that experiment. And I was talking to one of the groups in class about this. There's a lot of variation in human psychology across different human cultures, human societies. And most psychological research is actually looking at only a very small subset of human cultures and human societies. And so a couple years ago in this class, we read this really interesting paper. It's not required reading this year, but I just wanted to highlight it for those of you who are interested in reading it on your own. It's by Schultz et al., and the paper is all about how human societies differ in something called impersonal prosociality. So this really relates to the concept of cooperation. And so they measured a bunch of dimensions of impersonal prosociality by surveying people across different cultures, and they had different ways of measuring these things. But this slide just summarizes a small subset of ways of measuring impersonal prosociality. It's things like donating your blood. It's things like agreeing with the statement that most people can be trusted. It's agreeing with the statement that most people will treat you fairly. And it's things like being willing to donate more in a public goods game. And so on this slide, that there's some other kind of questionnaire or survey type questions as well that they asked the people in different cultures in this study. And so some of them are like, if you answered yes, it would be the opposite dimension of it would not be impersonal prosociality. It would represent personal prosociality. And that would be things like being willing to lie in court to help a close family member whose reckless driving killed a pedestrian. So if people answered yes, that they would lie in court to help their kin, that's cooperation, that's prosociality, but that's not impersonal. That's like helping your kin, right? So what they found is that people in different cultures vary a lot on these dimensions. There's some cultures where people are a lot more pro-social towards their kin and less helpful towards strangers. And then there's other societies where people are helpful, often as helpful to strangers as they are to their own kin. Okay, and so what they proposed in this fascinating paper was that much of this variation can be linked to a society's centuries of history of kinship associations in their social networks. And they came up with this measurement called the Kinship Intensity Index. And these two networks represent potential scenarios for what the Kinship Intensity Index would look like. And if you imagine that the colors on these network diagrams, hopefully you're able to see the different colors, but if you can, if you imagine that they represent different familial lineages, and so, bluer circles are closely related to each other and yellower circles are closely related to each other, share more genetic variation. Well, the network on the left is positively assorted with respect to family lineage, with respect to kinship. And so this represents a society that would score high on this kinship intensity index. And the network on the right, individuals have a lot of social interactions with non-kin as often as they do kin. And so the network on the left of the slide, on the right of the slide, is a society that is randomly assorted with respect to familial lineage. And so that's a society that would score low on the kinship intensity index. Okay, so in their paper, Schultz et al. Propose, and they test this hypothesis that this kinship intensity index is what explains impersonal prosociality. It's what explains why some people are as kind to strangers as they are to their own kins. And they propose that it's all down to the history of laws about marriage in a society. So there's some places where people have married their cousins for many centuries, and there's some places where that's been outlawed for many centuries. Okay, and so societies, they propose, that have a longer history of prohibiting cousin marriage have a lower kinship intensity index, so they look more like the network on the right, and people in those societies exhibit more impersonal prosociality. So this is a relatively new hypothesis, and I find it really intriguing. And it was a paper we read a couple of years ago, and students found it really interesting, but it was kind of a dense read, and so that's why we're not reading it this year. But if you're interested, it's there's a link to it there, and you can check it out. Okay, public goods. So what is a public goods game? Well, a public good is a non-excludable resource that anyone can benefit from, but it's costly to provide or maintain. So examples of public goods are things like roads, police services, the library, streetlights, public health, the sewer system, a clean atmosphere. And in a public goods game, you could think about different strategies. Producers or cooperators, that those terms represent a strategy of contributing or paying into the public good. Whereas free riders are individuals who don't contribute or kind of skimp on their contributions to the public good. Now, in the game, the best option for the individual is to under-contribute, because you'll be able to benefit from the public good without making much of a cost to yourself. But this leads to this free rider problem. When everybody does the optimal strategy for the individual, it just depletes the public good, and that leads to the tragedy of the commons. And so this is a real problem of our generations. How do we get people to cooperate in these scenarios? Because with things like climate change and environmental degradation, we're really facing these issues in the future. Okay, so we played a little public goods game for bonus marks on our final exam last week. And so anybody who participated in the game, you'd start with a credit worth 1 bonus mark on the final exam, and you had the choice to donate some percent of it back to the public good, which I would then double and then redistribute. And so people who participated had to decide what percent of your bonus point would you donate. Would you change that? What would you do if I was going to reveal the names of the students who were the biggest donors? And how would it change your behavior if I was going to reveal the names of the biggest free riders? And to just lay out the possible strategies here, what if our class was highly selfish? What if everybody kept their point to themselves? Well, if everybody donated nothing and everybody just withheld their bonus point, then everybody would just get 1 bonus point. All the players would just get what they retained. So there wouldn't be any kind of like common good. That was what happened if everyone was selfish. Okay, what about a really nice group? What if like all the participants were super generous, super cooperative, and everybody donated their entire point to the public pool? Well, if everybody did that, and then I doubled it and redistributed it, all the players would get 2 points. So that's better, right? That's better than being highly selfish overall. But if we have a middle ground group, if everybody withholds half of their point and donates the other half, well, then what happens in that scenario is that everybody gets 1.5 points in the end. Now, here's the kicker. Say we're in the really nice group scenario. If you're just one fully selfish player that joins the group of all really nice players, the selfish person who keeps their entire initial point to themselves, they're going to get approximately 3 points. They're going to do better. And similarly, in the middle ground group, a single fully selfish player who played in this middle ground group would get 2.5 points. So it's the problem is it's always better to be selfish for the individual, for the short-term gain. But of course, if everybody's selfish, it's not the best scenario overall. Okay, so here's what actually happened. So 22 students took part in our bonus game, and this histogram shows you the number of students. The height of the bars represents the number of students that chose to donate different amounts from 0 to 100%. So you can see that there's only one student who decided to keep the entire point to themselves. That's the smart strategy for the individual. And then you can see there's a lot of nice students, like 6 of the students donated their entire point to the public good. And then there's also a lot of middle grounders. There are 5 students in this game who decided to keep half and donate the other half. And then there's some other people in between. Okay, so in total, the public pool ended up being 12.2 points. And when I double that, I end up with 24.4, and then I redistribute that 24.4 equally to the 22 players. And what happens is that each person gets an extra payout of 1.1 points. So everybody earns 1.1 points plus whatever you withheld. Now this is really fascinating to me because I played this game with students in the course 2 years ago, and we got the exact same result. There were more students in the class that year. I think we had 37 participants in this game, but we ended up with like exactly 1.1 as being the average payout. So very interesting. Okay, so if you played, well done, and you'll get that bonus at the end of April on your final exam. Okay, so what about exposure, reputation? Did that affect people's willingness to donate? So these graphs show the relationship between a person's original donation, or their like decision on the x-axis, and their new donation on the y-axis in these 2 different scenarios. One where I said I would reveal the top donors, and one where I said I might reveal the free riders' names. And the dotted line across the diagonal in both cases is the line where the new donation is equal to the original donation. And I added a little bit of random noise to the data points because a lot of them overlap, so I wanted to make sure you could see. But the take-home message here is that a lot of the students in the game are kind of lining up on that dotted line. So for most people, there wasn't much change. A lot of people's answers were pretty consistent, but there were some big changes too. And so let's zoom in and look at those. So in the scenario where I said, what if I reveal the names of the top donors? Here's a different way of looking at that data. So here we have these 22 students plotted with their original donation on the left and then their new, what would you change to, on the right. And I've colored the line segments black if they didn't change. And I've colored them green if they said they would donate more. And I've colored them pink if they had said they would donate less. Okay, so maybe some of the students in this game are virtue signalers. However, on average, there was no statistically significant difference in the average change across the 22 students, and that is from a paired t-test. Interestingly, these 2 students who said they would donate less if I was going to reveal the names of the nicest, are they humble? Are they shy? Or are they just answering randomly? I'm not too sure. Okay, what about revealing the free riders? Well, this is where we see a more consistent effect. Now, there still are a lot of students who are just maintaining the same answer, but there is a statistically significant rise in the donation amounts on average. On average, there's an increase of about 13% with a p-value of 0.007. So it seems like for our class, the threat of being revealed as selfish was potentially a motivator for a lot of us. Okay. Okay, I just want to comment here that our emotions, our rationalizations, our morals, these are all just proximate mechanisms. We've all learned to behave in certain ways, and we get emotional rewards from being nice. And these emotions are just proximate mechanisms. And so just because something looks like altruism in the short term doesn't necessarily mean that the proximate mechanism, whether it's neural, hormonal, genetic, the proximate mechanism didn't necessarily evolve as evolutionary altruism. These underlying proximate mechanisms may have evolved because those mechanisms had a net self-benefit overall. For example, through causing us to help kin, through causing us to help in ways that we would get reciprocated, or through byproduct mutualism or enforcement. So this is similar to the argument about automatic imitation in that rock, paper, scissors game. The kind of short-term costs and benefits of behavior don't necessarily reflect why those behavioral proximate mechanisms evolved. And so it's important to keep in mind the difference between proximate and ultimate. And this can seem a little dark, but emotions like happiness and even love can evolve to serve certain self-advantageous purposes. Okay, so what about public goods occurring in nature? So are there public goods games that happen beyond humans? And the answer is yes. Microorganisms like bacteria and fungi secrete digestive enzymes and these things called siderophores into the environment. And these chemicals aid in the uptake of iron. So siderophores is a word that means iron carriers, and they're small compounds secreted by these microbes that bind to iron in the environment, and then they transport it across the cell membrane into the cell. And these compounds that are released out into the environment are public goods. They're costly for the individual microbe to produce, and they benefit others. They benefit the producer, but they potentially benefit others as well. And so these biochemical public goods games have been an important factor in the evolutionary diversification of microbes and in their ability to colonize new environments. For example, environments that don't have very much iron. And so understanding these processes is important for our health and antibiotic development. For example, one of the main ways our bodies fight infections is by doing something called iron withdrawal. So trying to prevent the infecting microbes from accessing our bodily iron. Microbe siderophores apparently also have mutualistic associations with plants, and they might be useful to us for sequestering pollution from soils. This is a process called phytoremediation. So there's lots of ways that these games that are being played by these microbes can be useful to us, lots of applications. Another example of public goods games in nature is found in plants. Plants produce and release volatile compounds that can have lots of beneficial effects, not just to the producer, but to other plants in the local environment. For example, they can release compounds that reduce herbivory by attracting predators that eat the herbivores. And this is a process called indirect defense. And it's what's illustrated in the diagram here. So this plant is getting munched by a caterpillar, and where it's wounded, it's undergoing a bunch of reactions and then releasing this volatile chemical that attracts these parasitoid wasps that then attack the caterpillar. And so this doesn't just benefit the plant that's being attacked, it benefits other plants in the same habitat as well. Okay, and another example of public goods games is found in these beetles and many other insects as well that produce pheromones to attract mates. So this is an example of a beetle aggregation, and it's often males that produce pheromones to attract females to a specific area. And these aggregation pheromones likely evolved from individual sex pheromones. But what probably happened was that if there's a lone beetle producing a pheromone to attract a female, what probably happened in these aggregation scenarios was that males started to respond to that pheromone as well, because if a female might be attracted there, well, then a male should be attracted there as well. So that's probably how these mating aggregations evolved. These have applications to us. We can use these pheromones in pest control. It can be a way to trap insects that eat our crops. For example, there's some beetles that cause a lot of economic damage in Canada by consuming a lot of our forests, and they use pheromones to attract mates, and so we might be able to exploit these chemicals to protect our forests. Okay, and one more application of public goods games happens with cancer. Cancer cells have a public good as well. And so if you think of the cells in a tumor as being a population, I mean, if you think about it from the perspective of what's good for the tumor, tumor cells secrete growth factors that help not just the cell that did the secreting, but also other cells in the area as well, other cancer cells as well. And a given tumor will be made up of a mix of different cell types, a mix of producers and free riders. And when people are developing treatments for cancer, it's important to understand the balance of heterogeneity in the cancer cell types, because if we only target one of the cell types, that won't be an effective treatment in the long term, because we really need to get rid of all of the cancer cells. Okay, so that wraps up public goods. And now we can begin the content on social learning, social cognition, and the wisdom of crowds. This image shows a bird in Europe that has learned to open up milk bottles that were for like many years a way of delivering milk to people across the country of England. And the birds learned how to open them up and steal the cream. And it was a really interesting case of birds in a couple of places discovering this around the same time in like the 1940s, and then it really spread throughout the country. And so that in the end, after a few decades, many birds in many places knew how to open milk bottles. If you've taken psychology or animal behavior, you've probably heard of the horse Clever Hans. This is a horse in Germany in the early 1900s, and the owner claimed that Hans could understand German and could do math, and he toured around showing off Hans's incredible abilities, asking the horse math questions, and then Hans, the horse, would ask him Hans, what's 4 + 5? And Hans would stomp his foot 9 times and get the answer correct. This phenomenon continues even today. This is a photograph of a dog named Maggie who appeared on some pet food commercials and TV shows, and who could apparently also answer math questions, including division. And you can watch some videos of her, but people were skeptical of her, as they were of Clever Hans, and realized that you needed to do the right kind of test to really show that the animal was doing what the owner claimed it was. And what people realized was that if you test the animal in a situation where it can't see the owner's facial expressions, the animal can't get these math questions correct. So it's not that the animal knows how to do 75 divided by 25 or 5 + 4. It's that these animals are very good at taking subtle, often unconsciously transmitted cues from their owners. And there's a nice link to a video here that I recommend watching. So even though Hans and Maggie can't do math, they really are clever. They're paying attention to these incredibly subtle cues, these tiny changes in facial expression and posture. And the ability of animals to learn these cues from their handlers is important. So for example, this was a recent study of dogs that are used for sniffing out bombs and drugs. And in the experiment, they brought the dogs in with their handlers, and they gave them the task of trying to find a hidden target in a series of packages. And they did 2 conditions. They did one condition where the human handler was told in advance which package had the target. And they did the other condition where the handler did not know which package was the hidden target. And the catch was there was no actual drug or bomb in any of the packages in this experiment. All of the packages were just empty. And yet all of the dog pair, all of the dogs, raised the alert about a particular package in this experiment. And when the handler had prior knowledge about which package was the target, it was almost always the package that the dog chose. So the point is, without being consciously aware of it, these handlers are transmitting information to the animal, and these animals are clever enough to pick up on these cues, which is really remarkable. So the dogs here really are clever, but it's actually the handlers' limitations that might be stopping them from doing their jobs properly. Okay, so this brings us to the topic today, learning, and especially social learning. So learning is, of course, a proximate cause of behavior. And just to set out the definition, learning is a change in behavior as a result of experience. You can think of it as the ability to produce different phenotypes depending on the environment. And so when animal behaviorists are thinking about learning, they have a couple of criteria that are laid out on the slide. the change in behavior has to result from experience. It has to be relatively permanent. And so this allows us to rule out transitory changes in behavior like hunger, right? So hunger is not a case of learning. It's a change in your behavior as a result of experience, but it's not a permanent one. And so then you might ask, okay, this course is about social evolution. What does that have to do with learning? Well, a lot of learning is social. A lot of learning comes from observing and learning from other individuals. These are images from another classic study in psychology called the Bobo doll experiment that was done earlier in the 1900s. And the researchers here studied children. And a child was placed in the room with this doll. And what happened in the experiment was an adult would come in, one of the experimenters would come in and would either assault the doll or not, and then the adult would leave. And then the researchers recorded what the kids did on their own. And kids who saw the adult hurting the doll, beating on the doll, those kids tended to do the same thing. So social learning is something that comes very easily to our species. As a definition, it's simply learning from another individual. Now, there are many different kinds of social learning, and on the next slides, I'm going to lay out the three main kinds. One special kind of social learning that I want to mention is called imprinting. Imprinting is a form of social learning that occurs early in life when individuals form irreversible attachments with a particular object or individual, and it often has to happen during a specific period of development. And so you might be familiar with the idea of imprinting, thinking about certain animals that get kept as pets. If the animals are reared from a young enough stage, they can imprint on their owner and they can see that owner as a parent. And so, for example, a lot of people who keep falcons, if they've kept that falcon from a very, like just from hatching, the falcon will see the owner, it will imprint on the owner as its parent. And the famous animal behaviorist Konrad Lorenz kept geese and they imprinted on him and followed him wherever he went. Okay, so what are the main types of social learning? So imprinting is kind of a special type, but there's three main types that researchers think about typically. The first type is called imitation. So imitation involves learning a behavior that is topographically novel. So for example, when the blue tits learned in Europe, learned to open milk bottles, that was a behavior that they had never done before. And so when they saw another bird doing it and then they began to do it themselves, that was imitation. Copying is another form of social learning, but copying just refers to a case where the behavior isn't new, it was already in the learner's repertoire. And so copying you can think of as like social contagion of something you already know how to do. I guess you could think of yawning, like you know how yawning is contagious. If one person yawns, you will probably yawn too. That's a form of social learning. It's a change in behavior, but it's copying. Everybody has yawned before. Matrix copying is another example of copying. And the third type of social learning is teaching. This is learning that involves active demonstration. That is, it's not passive or inadvertent. And so in the next few slides, we'll look at examples of each of these. Okay, so starting with imitation, the example I wanted to show you comes from a study of big brown bats. And these bats forage for insects using echolocation. And researchers haven't known how those abilities develop. Are they innate? Is learning involved? And so to try to answer that question, the researchers in this study kept big brown bats in captivity. And some of these bats were trained to feed on a mealworm that was suspended on a string from the ceiling of the chamber. And that's what's shown on the left of the slide. And so some of the bats learned how to feed in this unusual scenario. So this is a topographically novel behavior. So the researchers themselves had to train the bats how to do that. Then they brought in other bats that had not yet learned how to feed from this hanging prey. And then they would pair an experienced bat with a naive bat that had never fed from hanging prey before and put them in the room together. And I'm going to play a very short video clip that's going to show you what happened. And you're going to see a couple dots on the screen here. And there's There's a red dot that represents the experienced bat and a blue dot that represents the naive bat, and you'll hear some of their echolocation calls. And I'll mention that this video is slowed down a lot, right? In real life, this all happens much faster. So it's like a slow motion version. So you can see the experienced bat, the red one, going for the prey, and the two bats converging at that point. I'm not sure what, oh, there comes the blue one. Okay. All right. So they also categorize the outcome for the young, naive bats, ones that learned how to get the mealworm in white versus bats that were trying to do their normal feeding echolocation, but were not successful in getting the mealworm. And those are shown in gray and black. And what they found was that the naive bats that eventually learned how to get the mealworm were much more likely to have closely followed the demonstrator bat, the experienced bat. And so you can see that in the bar graph on the left, the white group, the naive bats that eventually learned how to do it, were, greater percentage of them had been following the experienced bat. So that tells us that social learning is probably involved when young bats learn how to forage. They seem to eavesdrop on the feeding calls of other bats. And presumably by following more closely behind the demonstrator, it gives more of a chance for these behaviors to be transmitted. Okay, the second type of learning is copying. Social learning, I should say, is copying. And again, it involves observing another individual, but the behavior is not a new skill, right? It's a behavior that the learner already has. But the point is that the demonstrator makes the learner more likely to do something. And so the little quote on the screen is just like a way I like to think about this. I can copy you even if you're doing something that's already within my repertoire. And so one example of this is mate choice copying. I showed this study before in this course. This is a study of kind of humans looking at pictures on a screen. And so what the researchers did was they showed the subjects in their study photographs of other people, either alone or with a potential like different sex partner. And they would ask the subject how attractive they found the individuals in this picture as potential mates. Okay, and so they were interested in the subject's willingness to be interested in a relationship with the people that they were seeing in these photographs. And the question was, if a potential mate was seen with an attractive partner, would that make the subject more likely to say that person, they'd be interested in that person as a mate? And these are the results there. So what they found was that both the men and women in their experiment, both the men and women subjects, were more interested in the potential partner, the photograph of a potential partner, when he or she was paired with an attractive partner than when they were paired with a less attractive person. So suggesting that humans may be influenced by mate choice copying. Okay, the third type of social learning is teaching. And this is one that involves active demonstration on the part of the demonstrator or the model. In other words, it's not passive or inadvertent. It means the demonstrator is doing something to try to create social learning on the part of the learner. Okay, and so one of the neatest ways that we think teaching goes on is in big cats. A lot of times mother cats will bring live prey to their cubs that have been maybe maimed and injured but not killed yet. And that gives the cubs a chance to practice some of these skills themselves. And the females in these species like cheetahs, they don't normally do this if they don't have cubs because it's a potential risk that the prey will be able to get away. So the question is, are the mother cheetahs teaching their cubs by bringing their cubs kind of disabled but still live prey? Okay, well, researchers have come up with 3 criteria that have to be met for something to count as teaching. Okay, here's what they are. The tutor has to modify their behavior in the presence of the naive learner. And this interaction has to allow the learner to learn faster than it would otherwise. And any immediate benefits are to be gained by the pupil only. It shouldn't be an immediate benefit to the tutor or the teacher in this case. Okay, so I'm going to dig into some examples of teaching in a few slides, but first I just want to cover some common misconceptions about social learning. We've learned the three main kinds. So what are some common misconceptions people have? Well, one misconception is that we have to be aware of social learning. And that's not true. Social learning does not require conscious awareness. Yawning is a perfect example of that. Like, these are things that can be transmitted without us being aware of it. And one example I like of that is shown by when people measuring walking speeds in cities. And this was a study done in the 1970s where they measured how fast people walked in a whole bunch of different cities around the world. And they plotted people's average walking speed in relation to city size. And what we find is that there's this really nice relationship where the larger the city, the faster people walk. So I don't think people necessarily are aware, right, of why this is happening. But I would propose that this may be a form of imitation. And so there's maybe kind of social contagion of the pace of life in cities, because people in the bigger cities are no genetically different from people in smaller cities. So there's things that you might pick up from your social environment without being aware of it. If everybody around you is walking fast, you may walk fast too. Okay, another common misconception is that social learning requires a large brain and advanced cognitive ability. That's also not true. There are lots of species that engage in social learning that have very small brains. And in fact, a few years ago in this beautiful study of fruit flies, researchers were able to show that fruit flies undergo mate choice copying. And so what they did was they painted the male fruit flies different colors, and they had observer females witness another female mate with a painted male. And in fact, in this scene, we've got two observing females and we've got two different colored males. So the green male is successfully mating, the pink male, I should say, is not. And then when the researchers tested those females later on and gave them a choice of another green male, another pink male, what they found was that the females would be more likely to choose the color phenotype that they had seen mating before, right? So having seen a female choose a green male in this scene, they'd be more likely to choose a different green male themselves later on. So even with their tiny brains, copying is possible. And they also show that this could be transmitted across multiple generations. So it could be kind of a transmission chain through time. This is quite remarkable. Okay, third misconception. Social learning always occurs within species. Most of it does, but social learning can occur from one species to another. And this is an example I really like about birds in Australia. In Australia, in the news some years ago, there were reports of like ghostly voices coming from the treetop, having weird conversations in English. And it was mostly pet birds, parrots and cockatoos, that had escaped and had begun teaching the wild cockatoos some of the words that they'd learned from their human owners. And apparently swearing was one of the most commonly heard phrases. Okay, so let's go back to teaching. How can we determine if a behavior is taught? For example, this behavior of milk bottle opening, was that teaching? How can we tell? Well, we have to look closely at these criteria. And the criteria of does the demonstrator modify its behavior in the presence of the naive learner? Well, if that's not met, then we can't say that we can rule this out as teaching, for example. What I want to look at first is an example of teaching in meerkats. So meerkats are these social mammals that live in these big communal groups of 20 to 50 individuals. And I'm going to play this really short video clip showing you some meerkat foraging behavior. They love eating scorpions, and they'll even eat species that are venomous enough to kill a human.
First, the meerkat bites off the stinger. Good move. And then it's time to tie on the feed bag. If scorpions aren't available, meerkats will also dine on anything they can overpower. beetles, spiders, even lizards and small rodents. But for a meerkat, nothing beats the crunchy goodness of a freshly killed scorpion. And who can argue? Although, well, a little ketchup might help.
Okay, so they love to eat these scorpions, but they have a skill of removing the venomous stinger. Okay, so the question is, do they teach their young to forage? Well, we need to check these 3 criteria. Well, researchers wanted to investigate this because they noticed that the older meerkats would sometimes disable the scorpion before giving it to their pups. Well, we can right away hone in on criteria number 3. Are the immediate benefits gained by the pupil only and not the tutor? Well, there's no immediate benefit to an older meerkat of providing a disabled prey to their pup. So we can say, yeah, that one is met right away. If anything, it's probably costly for an adult to give a live prey to a pup because the live prey has a chance of escaping. So far that one's met. Here's some data that addresses the first criteria, looking at whether adult meerkats adjust the type of prey they provision depending on pup experience. So researchers studying these meerkat colonies in the wild took lots and lots of observations of what the adults were giving the pups across a wide range of pup ages. So all of these graphs along the x-axis, the variable is the age of the pup in days, from 30 days to 90 days. And what they found was that the older the pups were, the more likely the adults were to give them live prey, right? So they were giving fully dead prey to the youngest pups, but as the pups got older, they got more and more chances with live disabled prey. Okay, so that addresses that first criteria. The adults are adjusting what they do depending on pup experience. And to really demonstrate that, they did another experiment, and that's what's shown here. And what they did was a playback experiment. So they wanted to know that this adjustment in the adult behavior was really all on the part of the adult. It wasn't because of something that the pups were doing. And so what they did was they played calls. They played calls to the adults that were either like newborn pup calls or older pup calls. And so the experiment condition on this graph is where they would take a pup, present a pup to an adult and play some other age, like play the calls of a different age group. And the control condition was where they would present the pup, a real pup, and they would play calls that represented the age that that pup really was. And the adults in this experiment were adults that all had quite young pups. And what they found was that when they played the calls that misrepresented the pup's age, the adults were more likely to feed the pup like a whole, intact live prey, a not disabled prey. And so they were playing calls that made the pup seem older than they were, and the adults were responding appropriately. They were modifying the way they responded, again, showing that the adults adjust their behavior to the experience of the pups. Okay, and when they did this same experiment, but then they focused on adults that had older pups, it had quite the opposite effect. So here the experimental group would be where they played like newborn pup sounds. And what happened was in the experimental group, the adults were much more likely to feed the pup appropriate prey for a newborn, which would be fully dead. Okay, so that criteria is met. Second criteria, I should say, third one we've looked at, but second one from our initial list, is does this behavior increase learning on the part of the pups? Well, the researchers studied this by doing experiments where the researchers provided scorpions to the pups, and I'll play you a really brief clip of what this looked like here. So they provision pups with prey items in these little experimental plastic bins, and they used dead scorpions, live stingless scorpions, or they have sometimes used eggs as their control group. And then they tested their ability on a scorpion that had its stinger still intact. And what they found was that the pups that they had trained on live stingless scorpions were the most successful at handling the intact, fully able scorpion as prey. So it's demonstrating that giving the pups this experience of a partially neutralized prey makes the pup more successful itself later on. So that one's met too. So it seems that meerkats teach. But what about ants? That might seem surprising to think that maybe ants do as well. But I'm going to show you some information from another study that says, well, if that's our definition of teaching, well, then it's present in insects as well. So this is a behavior found in ants and termites called tandem running. And it's where one individual, the leader, leads another, the follower, from the nest to some other location, like a food resource that the leader has found. And the whole time, the follower keeps contact with the leader by frequently doing these antennal touches. And I'm going to play a video of what it looks like. It's actually a really boring video. There's just two ants moving around, and periodically they make contact. And so that's what tandem running looks like. It doesn't even look that fast in the video. But what researchers showed back in 2006 was this fits the criteria for teaching. And so they showed, for example, for criteria number 3, there shouldn't be any benefit to the tutor. Well, they showed that the leader in a tandem running pair would get to the food much faster on its own, right? So it's clearly costly to the tutor to engage in tandem running, because if they just forgot, like just left the pupil on its own, they would get to the goal much faster. So it's cost them time. So that's true. Does the pupil learn as a result? Well, the follower gets to the food much faster as a result of this interaction. So they showed that that was true. And does the tutor modify their behavior? Well, what they showed was that the leader only moves ahead when it gets tapped on the body by the follower. And so the leader is modifying its behavior to ensure that the follower stays close. So if this is the definition of teaching, then ants teach. So to sum up, teaching may be rare, or maybe it's more common than we think, and we just haven't studied it very much yet. However, we can say for sure from ants and meerkats that teaching does not require a big brain, because meerkats aren't especially large-brained either. And so it could be the value of information more so than brain size that has influenced the evolution of teaching. Okay. Now, I want to just highlight that there are a couple of other ways that individuals can learn from others that are not considered social learning, because they're not learning from others, but they are learning in the presence of others. So these are ways that individuals can affect behavior that it looks like social learning, but it's not imitation, copying, or teaching. And so there's 2 of them that I have here. One of them is called local enhancement. And that's when the presence of other individuals attracts an animal to an area where then personal learning takes place. Like, for example, if a bird is attracted to another flock of birds and then it arrives at a place where there's milk bottles that it wouldn't normally have gone to, but it went there because it was attracted to the flock of other birds around there. And then it learned on its own how to open milk bottles. That's an example of local enhancement. The other one is called social facilitation. And that's when the presence of other individuals causes other changes in behavior that make learning more likely. So for example, maybe just being around other birds means that birds act more exploratory. And so maybe like if a bird is present in somebody's yard and there's other birds around, just the presence of the other birds means that they don't have to worry about predators as much, and they kind of are able to learn on their own more easily. And so that's called social facilitation. So it just means that having others around makes learning more easily for some other reason, like lower vigilance. Okay, so I just want to say that even though they don't count as imitation, copying, or teaching, these 2 processes are still important processes in social evolution. Okay, so stepping back out to looking at how social learning differs from personal learning in general, this is a bit of a summary slide. to compare those two types of learning on a number of dimensions. Social learning is special for quite a few reasons. So let's dig into that. So this is just the definition. Social learning is learning from other individuals as models, whereas personal learning is learning from your own direct experience of the environment. So what effects does that have on kind of information transmission and things like that? Well, if there's a new ability that can be introduced into a group, like learning to forage from some new food type, social learning is expected to allow that ability to spread rapidly. Whereas if the only way it could be learned was through personal learning, we expect that new ability to spread through the population much more slowly, because each individual has to figure it out on their own through trial and error. What about the probability that the group will lose a skill? Well, if the skill is socially learned, it's less probable that it will be lost. It's easier to retain. Whereas with personal learning, there's a greater chance that a particular skill can be lost from a population. And as our last thing in this table, what kind of population differences do we expect to see if an ability is driven by social learning versus personal learning? Well, if social learning is driving a lot of what's going on, then we expect populations could end up being different, just totally unrelated to characteristics of their environment, right? Because just because one individual figures something out, then it spreads within that group. It might be totally unrelated to what resources there are in the environment. And this is going to get into the topic of our final pre-recorded lecture about culture. On the other hand, if behavioral variation is mainly driven by personal learning, then we expect population differences to be very much related to the different environmental types. They should be related to the local kind of habitat that individuals are learning from. Okay, so we have a couple more topics in this lecture. The next one I want to touch on is social cognition. And I want to distinguish it from social learning. It's very related, but social cognition goes one step further. Social cognition is storing information about other individuals, about the social situations themselves. And people who have taken courses in psychology are probably familiar with all of this. Theory of mind has long been thought to be something that was special to humans. And this was the idea that an individual could know or have ideas about mental states of others. So like I might interpret something about your mental state, what's driving you to do the things you do. That's called theory of mind. It's something that we know humans have. And there's a task that psychologists develop to study theory of mind in like little children and try to understand, okay, when do children first develop it? Because if you ask a really small child, they can't really conceive of the fact that other people have thoughts yet, right? And it takes them to be about like 4 years old before they can understand this. And in this false belief task, what the researchers do is they have like a subject child watching this scene, and they'll have two experimenters. Here they're Sally and Anne. And Sally will put the red ball in the basket, and then Sally leaves the room. And Anne's in there alone with the little child in the experiment. Anne takes the ball out of the basket and puts it in the box. And then Sally comes back in. She says, oh, I want to play with my ball. And the researchers ask the little child, where is Sally going to look for the ball? Well, if you do this experiment with like a 3-year-old, they're going to say, she'll look in the box, because that's where the child knows the ball is. And they can't process the fact that Sally had a different memory of where it was. But once kids get a little bit older, we know that Sally will look in the place where she last thought the ball was, which is the basket, right? So that's theory of mind. So the question is, do animals have theory of mind? Well, there's some really compelling research suggesting that some birds do. And this research focused a lot on species of birds that cache food. So to survive kind of winter conditions, harsh conditions, there's certain bird species that collect food and store it in a cache. Black-capped chickadees do it, and western scrub jays is another species that does this. So they store caches. They also steal food from each other's caches all the time. And in this study in captivity, the researchers gave the jays these like ice cube trays to store their caches in, and they had kind of this barrier made of toys. And they had the jays store food caches either being watched by another jay or on their own. And actually, sorry, I kind of misspoke there. What they would do was they would allow the jays to recache, to take a cached food item and move it to a new cache. And what they found was that, I'll jump ahead here. What they found was that the birds that had been observed caching by another bird were much more likely to recache, to move their food later on. And that makes sense if birds have theory of mind, right? If you know that that other bird was watching you, it's a good strategy to move your cache because there's thieves out there. So it suggests that they can remember who had seen what, and this is quite sophisticated cognition. So it raises the question, do these jays have theory of mind? They definitely have some very sophisticated cognitive abilities. Some people have even proposed that social evolution might be a reason why human brains evolved to be so complex, so large. The social brain hypothesis posits that the increasing complexity of our social networks and our need to kind of maintain lots of relationships, maybe even manipulate other people, is what drove the expansion of our brains. Keeping track of lots of people's motivations, reputations, deceptions, that can be very complex cognitively. And this hypothesis is not proven by any means, but some evidence along those lines comes from this proximate study of macaques in the lab, where researchers showed that the individual macaques with a larger social network, the macaques that had more social connections, had certain regions of their brain were larger in volume. So having a lot of social interactions does, at a proximate level, influence the size and kind of allocation of our brain and that of our close relatives. But this proximate change doesn't prove the evolutionary hypothesis. So some studies have shown, like looking across species in an evolutionary way, some species have shown a correlation between primate group size and brain size. So like the larger grouped mammals tend to have larger brains, but other studies actually don't find that. So there's really mixed evidence for this social brain hypothesis. And for example, in primates, if you account for diet differences, sociality does not predict brain size. And then, of course, we have lots of exceptions, like meerkats live in these really complex societies, yet they have pretty small brains. And eusocial insects have perhaps the most complex social hierarchies, but they have much smaller brains, of course, than mammals. And of course, it could also be true that maybe the evolution of larger brains caused our social relationships to become more complex. Okay, so the last section of this lecture I want to talk about is something called the wisdom of crowds. So remember, one of the advantages of group living is increased problem-solving ability. The pool of competence hypothesis is that the larger your social group is, the more likely somebody in it will have a specific experience or knowledge or skill to solve a problem you may face. So it's like, it's easier to solve an escape room if you're in a decent sized group of people than it might be to solve that escape room on your own. Okay, this is the two heads are better than one principle. And it's been shown to be beneficial in some animal foraging experiments. For example, birds that are in a flock are better at solving a puzzle than they are on their own. And larger groups often solve problems faster than smaller groups. But there's actually other reasons why groups can provide an advantage in problem solving. And so the one I want to highlight here is one called the many wrongs hypothesis or mechanism. And it's an example that we can recreate in humans by asking people to answer a question that people don't know the answer to, right? So If I ask you how much does this cow weigh, if you took Biology 1105, you probably answered a survey. I asked you that before. And the only clue I would give you is that the man in this picture weighs 165 pounds. So how much do you think this cow weighs? And most of you would get an answer that was pretty far off. But when people survey a large number of people, these errors on average cluster around the true weight of the cow. And so if you add up a lot of wrong answers, the average of that distribution is actually pretty close to the actual weight of the cow. So researchers did it with this particular cow online, and the cow actually weighs about 1,355 pounds, but the average of the people's guesses was very close. It was about 1,287 pounds. So very, very close answer to the actual answer. And what's amazing is that that sometimes non-experts on average can be just as good as experts. So this is a distribution of answers from like people who had worked with cows, and you can see like the mean of this distribution is just as close to the actual weight as the mean of the distribution of people who have no knowledge of cows. So many wrongs can make a right. So the many wrongs hypothesis is that the aggregation of a lot of individuals, each of whom is wrong, but where your wrongness is random with respect to the true value, that can result in a decision that's better on average than a decision made by a single member of the group. And this is really fascinating because it might explain, for example, animal navigation. So many navigating animals travel together in flocks. And each of the individuals in this flock has a lot of sensory mechanisms for navigation. They might have magnetic sense. They might be able to use features in the sky as compass indicators. They can use vision. They sometimes even use olfactory cues to navigate. And each of these senses can have sources of error, and any one individual is going to be imperfect. But perhaps by traveling as a group, the average of their error-prone choices will yield a route that's more direct and more successful. And so there's evidence that this works using homing pigeons. So these are pigeons that are bred for their ability to be displaced from their home loft, sometimes thousands of miles away. And then when you release them in this new place, they can find their way back home. In this study, researchers tested whether groups of homing pigeons could navigate more effectively than solitary homing pigeons. And so they drove the pigeons away from the loft and had them wear little GPS backpacks, and then they released them on this route that was about 30 kilometers away from the home loft. And they initially released each of the pigeons on its own as a solo flight. Then they did the same trip but released them in flocks. And then they did the same trip but released them as solos. I explained that wrong. Pigeons were either released initially on their own or they were released initially in a flock, right? So the solo and flock condition that's shown in white and black on these graphs is the first time doing this route for all of the pigeons. And what they found was that the flocks were able to get back to the home faster. So they flew with a faster speed and they were able to get there in a straighter path. So you can see how the straightness of the flocks is higher. So it suggests that there's an advantage here to flying in a group. Now, we don't know if this is because of many wrongs. It could be because of two heads being better than one, or it could be some other mechanism. Like maybe in a group, the pigeons are able to be less vigilant to dangers, right? Because maybe you're less worried about a predator if you've got 6 other pigeons around you. And so maybe they are more effective at navigation because they allocate less of their attention to these other risks. Okay, just as my last slide here, I want to add that these social learning strategies, the wisdom of crowds, these are potentially important to us for technology. They might inspire us to have better strategies for like drones that deliver goods or that have to navigate without collisions to perform tasks for us. So we can learn from these kinds of small-brained organisms that have sophisticated, successful ways of doing things. Okay, and I'll end again with just a reminder that this Friday we're reading a paper about pigeon navigation, and that next Wednesday, 8:35 a.m. on Zoom, we'll have a synchronous session with some guest speakers. And I'm going to post one more lecture. It will be the last one, all about culture.